The Sword and the Stone, Chapter 18. The wart lay awake as he had been told to do. He was to wait until Kay was asleep, and then Archimedes would come for him with Merlin's magic. He lay under the great bearskin and stared out of the window at the stars of spring, no longer frosty and metallic, but as if they had been new-washed and had swollen with the moisture. It was a lovely evening, without rain or cloud. The sky between the stars was of the deepest and fullest velvet. Framed in the thick western window, Aldebaran and Betelgeuse were racing Sirius over the horizon, the hunting dog star looking back to his master Orion, who had not yet heaved himself above the rim. In at the window came also the unfolding scent of benighted flowers, for the currants, the wild cherries, the plums, and the hawthorn were already in bloom, and no less than 5 nightingales within earshot were holding a contest of beauty among the bowery, the looming trees. Wart lay on his back with his bearskin half off him and his hands clasped behind his head. It was too beautiful to sleep, too temperate for the rug. He watched out at the stars in a kind of trance. Soon it would be the summer again, when he could sleep on the battlements and watch these stars hovering as close as moths above his face, and, in the Milky Way at least, with something of the mothy pollen. They would be at the same time so distant that unutterable thoughts of space and eternity would baffle themselves in his sighing breast, and he would imagine to himself how he was falling upward, higher and higher among them, never reaching, never ending, leaving and losing everything in the tranquil speed of space. He was fast asleep when Archimedes came for him. "Eat this," said the owl, and handed him a dead mouse. The wart felt so strange that he took the furry atomy without protest and popped it into his mouth without any feelings that it was going to be nasty. So he was not surprised when it turned out to be excellent, with a fruity taste like eating a peach with the skin on, though naturally the skin was not so nice as the mouse. "Now we had better fly," said the owl. "Just flip to the window sill here to get accustomed to yourself before we take off." Wart jumped for the sill and automatically gave himself an extra kick with his wings, just as a high jumper swings his arms. He landed on the sill with a thump, as owls are apt to do, did not stop himself in time, and toppled straight out of the window. "This," he thought to himself cheerfully, "is where I break my neck." It was curious, but he was not taking life seriously. He felt the castle walls streaking past him, and the ground and the moat swimming up. He kicked with his wings, and the ground sank again, like water in a leaking well. In a second, that kick of his wings had lost its effect, and the ground was welling up. He kicked again. It was strange, going forward with the earth ebbing and flowing beneath him, in the utter silence of his down-fringed feathers. "For heaven's sake," panted Archimedes, bobbing in the dark air beside him, "stop flying like a woodpecker. Anybody would take you for a little owl if the creatures had been imported. What you are doing is to give yourself flying speed with one flick of your wings. You then rise on that flick until you have lost flying speed and begin to stall. Then you give another, just as you are beginning to drop out of the air, and do a switchback. It is confusing to keep up with you." "Well," said the wart recklessly, "if I stop doing this, I shall go bumped altogether." "Idiot," said the owl. "Waver your wings all the time, like me, instead of doing these jumps with them." The wart did what he was told, and was surprised to find that the earth became stable, and moved underneath him without tilting, in a regular pour. He did not feel himself to be moving at all. "That's better." "How curious everything looks," observed the boy with some wonder, now that he had time to look about him. And indeed, the world did look curious. In some ways, the best description of it would be to say that it looked like a photographer's negative, for he was seeing one ray beyond the spectrum which is visible to human beings. An infrared camera will take photographs in the dark, when we cannot see, and it will also take photographs in daylight. The owls are the same, for it is untrue that they can only see at night. They see in the day just as well, only they happen to possess the advantage of seeing pretty well at night also. So naturally, they prefer to do their hunting then, when other creatures are more at their mercy. To the wart, the green trees would have looked whitish in the daytime, as if they were covered with apple blossom. And now, at night, everything had the same kind of different look. It was like flying in a twilight which had reduced everything to shades of the same color, and, as in the twilight, there was a considerable amount of gloom. "Do you like it?" asked the owl. "I like it very much." Do you know, when I was a fish, there were parts of the water which were colder or warmer than the other parts, and now it is the same in the air.
The temperature, said Archimedes, depends on the vegetation of the bottom. Woods or weeds, they make it warm above them.
Well, said the wort, I can see why the reptiles who had given up being fishes decided to become birds. It certainly is fun.
You are beginning to fit things together, remarked Archimedes. Do you mind if we sit down?
How does one?
You must stall. That means you must drive yourself up until you lose flying speed. And then, just as you feel yourself beginning to tumble, why, you sit down. Have you never noticed how birds fly upward to perch? They don't come straight down on the branch, but dive below it and then rise. At the top of their rise, they stall and sit down.
But birds land on the ground, too. And what about mallards on the water? They can't rise to sit on that.
Well, it is perfectly possible to land on flat things, but more difficult. You have to glide in at the stalling speed all the way, and then increase your wind resistance by cupping your wings, dropping your feet, tail, etc. You may have noticed that few birds do it gracefully. Look how a crow thumps down, and how the mallard splashes. The spoon-winged birds, like heron and plover, seem to do it best. As a matter of fact, we owls are not so bad at it ourselves.
And the long-winged birds, like swifts, I suppose they are the worst, for they can't rise from a flat surface at all.
The reasons are different, said Archimedes. Yet the fact is true. But need we talk on the wing? I am getting tired.
So am I.
Owls usually prefer to sit down every 100 yards.
The wort copied Archimedes in zooming up toward the branch which they had chosen. He began to fall just as they were above it, clutched it with his furry feet at the last moment, swayed backward and forward twice, and found that he had landed successfully. He folded up his wings. While the wort sat still and admired the view, his friend proceeded to give him a lecture about flight in birds. He told how, although the swift was so fine a flyer that he could sleep on the wing all night, and although the wort himself had claimed to admire the way in which rooks enjoyed their flights, the real aeronaut of the lower strata, which cut out the swift, was the plover. He explained how plovers indulged in aerobatics, and would actually do such stunts as spins, stall turns, and even rolls for the mere grace of the thing. They were the only birds which made a practice of slipping off height to land, except occasionally the oldest, gayest, and most beautiful of all the conscious aeronauts, the raven. Wart paid little or no attention to the lecture, but got his eyes accustomed to the strange tones of light instead, and watched Archimedes from the corner of one of them. For Archimedes, while he was talking, was absent-mindedly spying for his dinner. This spying was an odd performance. A spinning top which is beginning to lose its spin slowly describes circles with its highest point before falling down. The leg of the top remains in the same place, but the apex makes circles which get bigger and bigger toward the end. This is what Archimedes was absent-mindedly doing. His feet remained stationary, but he moved the upper part of his body round and round, like somebody trying to see from behind a fat lady in a cinema, and uncertain which side of her gave the best view. As he could turn his head almost completely round on his shoulders, you may imagine that his antics were worth watching. "What are you doing?" asked the wart.
Even as he asked, Archimedes was gone. First there had been an owl talking about plover, and then there was no owl. Only, far below the wart, there was a thump and a rattle of leaves, as the aerial torpedo went smack into the middle of a bush, regardless of obstructions. In a minute the owl was sitting beside him again on the branch, thoughtfully breaking up a dead sparrow. "May I do that?" asked the wart, inclined to be bloodthirsty. "As a matter of fact," said Archimedes, after waiting to crop his mouthful, "you may not. The magic mouse which turned you into an owl will be enough for you. After all, you have been eating as a human all day, and no owl kills for pleasure. Besides, I'm supposed to be taking you for education, and as soon as I have finished my snack here, that is what we shall have to do."
"Where are you going to take me?"
Archimedes finished his sparrow, wiped his beak politely on the bough, and turned his eyes full on the wart. These great round eyes had, as a famous writer has expressed it, a bloom of light upon them, like the purple bloom of powder on a grape. "Now that you've learned to fly," he said, "Merlin wants you to try the wild geese." The place in which he found himself was absolutely flat. In the human world, we seldom see flatness, for the trees and houses and hedges give a serrated edge to the landscape. Even the grass sticks up with its myriad blades. But here, in the belly of the night, The illimitable, flat, wet mud was as featureless as a dark junket. If it had been wet sand even, it would have had those little wave marks, like the palate of your mouth. In this enormous flatness there lived one element, the wind. For it was an element. It was a dimension, a power of darkness. In the human world, the wind comes from somewhere and goes somewhere, and as it goes, it passes through somewhere, through trees or streets or hedgerows. This wind came from nowhere. It was going through the flatness of nowhere to no place. Horizontal, soundless except for a peculiar boom, tangible, infinite, the astounding dimensional weight of it streamed across the mud. You could have ruled it with a straight edge. The titanic gray line of it was unwavering and solid. You could have hooked the crook of your umbrella over it, and it would have hung there. The wart, facing into this wind, felt that he was uncreated. Except for the wet solidity under his webbed feet, he was living in nothing. A solid nothing, like chaos. His were the feelings of a point in geometry, existing mysteriously on the shortest distance between 2 points, or of a line drawn on a plane surface which had length, breadth, but no magnitude. No magnitude. It was the very self of magnitude. It was power, current, force, direction, a pulseless world stream steady in limbo. Bounds had been set to this unhallowed purgatory. Far away to the east, perhaps a mile distant, there was an unbroken wall of sound. It surged a little, seeming to expand and contract, but it was solid. It was menacing, being desirous for victims, for it was the huge, remorseless sea. 2 miles to the west, there were 3 spots of light in a triangle. They were the weak wicks from fishermen's cottages, who had risen early to catch a tide in the complicated creeks of the salt marsh. Its waters sometimes ran contrary to the ocean. These were the total features of his world, the sea sound and the 3 small lights. Darkness, flatness, vastness, wetness, and, in the gulf of night, the Gulf Stream of the wind. When daylight began to come, by premonition, the boy found that he was standing among a crowd of people like himself. They were seated on the mud, which now began to be disturbed by the angry, thin, returning sea, or else were already riding on the water, wakened by it, outside the annoyance of the surf. The seated ones were large teapots, their spouts tucked under their wings. The swimming ones sometimes ducked their heads and shook them. Some, waking on the mud, stood up and wagged their wings vigorously, their profound silence broken by a conversational gabble. There were about 400 of them in the gray vicinity, very beautiful creatures, the wild white-fronted geese, whom, once he has seen them close, no man ever forgets. Long before the sun came, they were making ready for flight. Family parties of the previous year's breeding were coming together in batches, and these batches were themselves inclined to join with others, possibly under the command of a grandfather, or else of a great-grandfather, or else of some noted leader in the host. When the drafts were complete, there came a faint tone of excitement into their speech. They began moving their heads from side to side in jerks, and then, turning into the wind, suddenly they would all be in the air together, 14 or 40 at a time, with wide wings scooping the blackness and a cry of triumph in their throats. They would wheel round, climbing rapidly, and be gone from sight. 20 yards up, they were invisible in the dark. The earlier departures were not vocal. They were inclined to be taciturn before the sun came, only making occasional remarks, or crying their single warning note if danger threatened. Then, at the warning, they would all rise vertically to the sky. The wart began to feel an uneasiness in himself. The dim squadrons about him, setting out minute by minute, infected him with a tendency. He became restless to embrace their example, but he was shy. Perhaps their family groups, he thought, would resent his intrusion. Yet he wanted not to be lonely. He wanted to join in, and to enjoy the exercise of morning flight, which was so evidently a pleasure. They had a comradeship, free discipline, and joie de vivre. When the goose next to the boy spread her wings and leaped, he did so automatically. Some 8 of those nearby had been jerking their bills, which he had imitated as if the act were catching. And now, with these same 8, he found himself on pinion in the horizontal air. The moment he had left the earth, the wind had vanished. Its restlessness and brutality had dropped away as if cut off by a knife. He was in it, and at peace. The 8 geese spread out in line astern, evenly spaced, with him behind. They made for the east, where the poor lights had been, and now before them the bold sun began to rise. A crack of orange vermilion broke the black cloud bank far beyond the land. The glory spread, the salt marsh growing visible below. He saw it like a featureless moor or bogland, which had become maritime by accident. Its heather, still looking like heather, having mated with the seaweed until it was a salt, wet heather with slippery fronds. The burns which should have run through the moorland were of seawater, on bluish mud. There were long nets here and there, erected on poles, into which unwary geese might fly. These, he now guessed, had been the occasions for those warning notes. 2 or 3 widgeon hung in one of them, and, far away to the eastward, a fly-like man was plodding over the slob in tiny persistence, to collect his bag. The sun, as it rose, tinged the quicksilver of the creeks and the gleaming slime itself with flame. The curfew, who had been piping their mournful plaints since long before the light, flew now from weed-bank to weed-bank. The widgeon, who had slept on water, came whistling their double notes, like whistles from a Christmas cracker. The mallard toiled from land against the wind. The redshanks scuttled and prodded like mice. A cloud of tiny dunlin, more compact than starlings, turned in the air with the noise of a train. The blackguard of crows rose from the pine trees on the dunes with merry cheers. Shorebirds of every sort populated the tide line, filling it with business and beauty. The dawn, the sea dawn, and the mastery of ordered flight were of such intense beauty that the boy was moved to sing. He wanted to cry a chorus to life, and since 1,000 geese were on the wing about him, he had not long to wait. The lines of these creatures, wavering like smoke upon the sky as they breasted the sunrise, were all at once in music and in laughter. Each squadron of them was in different voice, some larking, some triumphant, some in sentiment or glee. The vault of daybreak filled itself with heralds, and this is what they sang. You turning world, pouring beneath our pinions, hoist the hoar-sun to welcome morning's minions. See on each breast the scarlet and vermilion, hear from each throat the clarion and carillon. Hark the wild wandering lines and black battalions, heaven's horns and hunters, dawn-bright hounds and stallions. Free, free, far, far, and fair on wavering wings, comes Anser Albifrons, and sounds and sings. He was in a coarse field in daylight. His companions of the flight were grazing round him, plucking the grass with sideways wrenches of their soft, small bills, bending their necks into abrupt loops, unlike the graceful curves of the swan. Always, as they fed, one of their number was on guard, its head erect and snake-like. They had mated during the winter months, or else in previous winters, so that they tended to feed in pairs within the family and squadron. The young female, his neighbor of the mud flats, was in her first year. She kept an intelligent eye upon him. The boy, watching her cautiously, noted her plump, compacted frame, and a set of neat furrows on her neck. These furrows, he saw out of the corner of his eye, were caused by a difference in the feathering. The feathers were concave, which separated them from one another, making a texture of ridges which he considered graceful. Presently the young goose gave him a shove with her bill. She had been acting sentry. "You next," she said. She lowered her head without waiting for an answer, and began to graze in the same movement. Her feeding took her from his side. He stood sentry. He did not know what he was watching for, nor could he see any enemy, except the tussocks and his nibbling mates, but he was not sorry to be a trusted sentinel for them. "What are you doing?" she asked, passing him after half an hour. "I was on guard." "Go on with you," she said with a giggle, or should it be a gaggle. "You are a silly." "Why?" "You know." "Honestly," he said, "I don't. Am I doing it wrong? I don't understand." "Peck the next one. You have been on for twice your time, at least." He did as she told him, at which the grazer next to them took over, and then he walked along to feed beside her. They nibbled, noting one another out of beady eyes. "You think I am stupid," he said shyly, confessing the secret of his real species for the first time to an animal. "But it is because I am not a goose. I was born as a human. This is my first flight, really." She was mildly surprised. "It is unusual," she said. "The humans generally try the swans. The last lot we had were the children of Lear. However, I suppose we're all anseriforms together." "I have heard of the children of Lear." "They didn't enjoy it. They were hopelessly nationalistic and religious, always hanging about round one of the chapels in Ireland. You could say that they hardly noticed the other swans at all. I am enjoying it. I thought you were. What were you sent for? To learn my education. They grazed in silence until his own words reminded him of something he had wanted to ask. The sentries, he asked. Are we at war? She did not understand the word. War? Are we fighting people? Fighting? She asked doubtfully. The men fight sometimes, about their wives and that. Of course there is no bloodshed, only scuffling to find the better man. Is that what you mean? No, I meant fighting against armies, against other geese, for instance. She was amused. How ridiculous! You mean a lot of geese all scuffling at the same time? It would be fun to watch. Her tone surprised him, for his heart was still a kind one, being a boy's. Fun to watch them kill each other? To kill each other? An army of geese to kill each other? She began to understand this idea slowly and doubtfully, an expression of distaste coming over her face. When it had sunk in, she left him. She went away to another part of the field in silence. He followed, but she turned her back. Moving round to get a glimpse of her eyes, he was startled by their dislike, a look as if he had made some obscene suggestion. He said lamely, I am sorry. I don't understand. Leave talking about it. I'm sorry. Later, he added with annoyance, A person can ask, I suppose. It seems a natural question, with the sentries. But she was thoroughly angry. Will you stop about it at once? What a horrible mind you must have. You have no right to say such things. And of course there are sentries. There are the gerfalcons and the peregrines, aren't there? The foxes and the ermines and the humans with their nets. These are natural enemies. But what creature could be so low as to go about in bands to murder others of its own blood? Ants do, he said obstinately, and I was only trying to learn. She relented with an effort to be good-natured. She wanted to be broad-minded if she could, for she was rather a blue stocking. My name is Leo Leoc. You had better call yourself Kikwa, and then the rest will think you came from Hungary. Do you all come here from different places? Well, in parties, of course. There are some here from Siberia, some from Lapland, and I can see one or two from Iceland. But don't they fight each other for the pasture? Dear me, you are a silly, she said. There are no boundaries among the geese. What are boundaries, please? Imaginary lines on the earth, I suppose. How can you have boundaries if you fly? Those ants of yours, and the humans too, would have to stop fighting in the end if they took to the air. I like fighting, said the wart. It is knightly. Because you are a baby.